You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I'm joined by Nash Milani, otherwise known as Cassidy Civet, for a conversation about furries and what that's all about. So to start off with, what does it mean to be a furry? And can you introduce yourself as well?
Yes. Hi, Nicola. Thank you for having me on. I am on the internet, otherwise known as Cassidy Civet, a pop star of the furry fandom, as it were. Though, of course, offline, Nash Milani, and for other such, more official purposes. But what it means to be a furry, for me, is just that you like anthropomorphic animals. That's the big word, the big Scrabble tile word. But really what it means is human characteristics being given to things that otherwise wouldn't have them. So, if it's an animal standing on two legs, you start to make them more of a cartoon. They're walking, talking, joking, all that stuff is what makes a furry character furry, really, is that sort of touch of humanity.
And what are some misconceptions that people might have about furries?
Oh, where to begin?
A lot of them.
Yes. We've been, portrayed sometimes negatively in the media, and that shapes the perception on a greater, cultural scale. We're still feeling the ramifications of that CSI episode from 20 years ago.
Oh, I don't know this one, I don't think.
Yeah, it's called Fur and Loathing. And yeah, it's like, oh no, there's a murder at the fur con, and then everyone is like a sexual deviant. But that's very much not the case in the fandom broadly. But even those sorts of misrepresentations actually just educate the public that this thing exists. And then when they go and explore it for themselves, they realize that it's not all that it was shown to be on television. So in terms of perception of the fandom, it's a lot more diverse than that. It's not just a community of people looking for buddies for the bedroom, but it's a diverse group of artists, artisans, musicians, craftspeople. Like the amount of people that can draw in the community is very high. Animators, just a whole, group of people that are being brought together by the uniting thing that is anthropomorphic animals, animals with character and attitude, and just, the ability to express on a human level while not being human, because being human is boring.
So is that sort of what led you then to being a furry? Is that boredom with just being a regular human, or is there some other factors involved here?
Yeah, so like most fandom sorts of communities, furry is definitely escapism, Like at the end of the day, if it's whether you're pretending to be a cartoon animal or pretending to be a vampire teen, one of those, or something like that, I would maybe say maybe make a wizarding joke, but we're not going to talk about that. But that's essentially what it is at the end of the day. It's escapism, and it's getting away from who you are on a day-to-day basis. Because at the end of the day, you will still be you, but it's how you choose to express yourself in a community full of other people that, might have their own favorite animals and might have their own favorite sorts of topics that nestle within that niche where you can communicate and chat. And I think that's why furry is so unique, because we don't circle around a singular property, a single IP. We've existed since Anubis in ancient Egypt, and we are still being put in the pop culture with movies like Zootopia and whatever now. Because people and humanity and, Aesop's fables, we've always been interested in the idea that animals are, wise and know more than they let on. So when you start to humanize them and give them those characteristics, you can tell some really great stories with them that you just can't with people. And that's what really allows the creativity to flourish in the community, I think. That's what brings people together.
Right. I mean, that sounds like an incredible history dating back to ancient Egypt and
We love
having
Anubis.
this ability to be creative, but at the same time, you're getting this sort of media coverage or awareness brought to furries through CSI, for instance, that maybe isn't positive. And so, do you find that there's a lot of societal judgment?
Yeah, I mean, we've lived through a few different furry society panics. You know, this is I don't want to go too political, but I mean, there was the whole thing last year with the litter boxes that got brought up, right? And it was just like not a thing that was actually happening. But when people don't understand the thing that they're talking about, you know, the unknown, their brain fills in the gaps and things that are being used for other stuff. Like the reason that there was, you know, kitty litter in those American classrooms was darker than kids, you know, dressing up as cats and needing to use it. Like that was not a thing that was happening.
And can you explain that situation a little bit? Because I don't know that our listeners are all going to be aware
Sure.
of what happened there.
Yeah. Well, you know, in America, in place of gun laws, they've decided to start putting, you know, buckets of kitty litter in the classrooms because much like you'd see sand on the road after a gruesome car accident, it's absorbent. And that's why they have it, because instead of protecting the kids, they'd rather have a cleanup method. But when you have these opportunistic conservative types that see this, and then they hear vaguely about, oh, there's a kid meowing in the classroom, they connect the dots and in a way that paints the community negatively and also doesn't address what is actually the problem. So yeah, we've been at the end of a couple different issues like that. The way that the community has had to like go on literally some of the news shows to talk about these things. Like there have been furries on Fox News, which I know sounds kind of ironic in a way, but like that's happened and they've had to explain it. And it's kind of annoying that we have to, but we have to be willing to do it because people do not just look at the group. You know, you look at a photo of all these costumed characters, they don't know what they don't know. They have to be told, like, yes, this is a wholesome space. People are just dressing up for fun. No one is going to the bathroom in a litter box at any convention or in any classroom in America. I promise you that. It's just escapism. It's just finding a community that you feel comfortable within and, you know, finding a way to portray yourself that is very true to who you are. Usually people that create their persona as their like furry character persona, it's what they would perceive as the most ideal version of themselves.
Right. I mean, it to me, it's kind of wild that whole situation exists because especially when you talk about the states and the fact that there's all of these guns that are making their way into schools and harming kids. And the solution is not let's restrict guns. It's let's put litter box in classrooms. Like that's wild. But also then the same people that are creating that problem are trying to turn it into a different problem and blame that on furries. But you mentioned a word there that I want to touch on, which is fursona, and you kind of briefly explained what that is. Can you talk about how you create a fursona, and does someone have to wear a costume to be a furry and have a fursona?
That's a good question. There's a research group that I will mention this first because they're actually funded in part by the Canadian government. FirstScience.ca, got to shout them out. It's an incredible group. And they do data analysis on the people in the furry fandom, though primarily at conventions. So, of course, the data will be a little bit skewed as to furries that can, you know, afford the travel and the hotels to go to these events. But they also have done some online surveys as well. They just have to be a little bit more careful because you can't take data from underage people, right? So you got to be careful how you do these surveys. And what they have found is that it's like, I think it's 1 in 8 furries actually has a full costume. So it's not that high, but it's just visually what people notice, right? It's when you see the picture and you imagine a furry, you see the costume, that's what the perception becomes. But having gone to like over 50 conventions by this point in my life, I have seen that the suiting to non-suiting ratios at conventions changes drastically from place to place. And in general, you don't need any kind of furry related attire to be a furry or to go to a convention. You don't need to have ears on, a tail. You don't need anything quite like that. And, you know, that's part of what makes the fandom cool is that you will be understood to be a furry even if you're not fully decked out in the garb. And that can be, some people perceive it as like a barrier to entry, but it's not. Like, you don't need it. And some people feel like they do because maybe they're shy and they'd rather cover their face and stuff. And that's the whole, you know, escapism side of the costuming aspect of the community is because when you're, dressed as a giant blue dog, you're not a human anymore, and you can run around and do things like a blue dog, like that's part of the fun. But when with a fursona specifically, not a fursuit, you would get a fursuit of your fursona, but a furry persona is when you see an animal or you connect with a creature, a little critter, and you're like, no, that little fella's neat. Now, what if he like stood up on two legs, wore pants, and maybe had a job? Though, the job's not necessary. But my character is a civet, which is not a common animal in North America in that it doesn't exist here, but is an animal from Africa and Asia that I happened to see one time by chance while watching my favorite show, Survivor. And they just cut to animals in the jungle sometimes, and they showed a civet one time in like 2012, and I was like, what is that? So I took a low-grain photo with my old smartphone, and I showed people at my high school. I'm like, do you know what this is? And nobody knew. And then I was like, I guess I should ask the internet. And I got my answer within a matter of hours after that. And I got hit with a wave of inspiration, designed the character the next day, and I haven't changed since. And some people will find something they connect with that quickly, whether it's furry or anything else. Sometimes it happens that fast. But you don't even need a fursona to be a furry. I know people that don't have one.
They're just interested in these sort of human forms of animals that like that's sort of what constitutes a furry. Or like if you're talking about someone who's just wearing a tail and ears for fun, does that automatically make them a furry, or is that kind of its own separate thing?
I think ultimately what makes a person a furry is them calling themselves a furry.
It's an identification thing. Self-identification.
You would have to call yourself that. Like in the 2000s when you'd see teens with like the little clip-on tails on their like belt or on their side. They are not necessarily furries just because they have a tail attached to their person, Just because someone's got like a paw print tattoo does not necessarily make them a furry. I had a pretty funny moment one time when I was at an airport in the States getting off the plane to go to a convention. It was in Denver. And I saw a person who was very obviously queer. They had a dyed hair and they had a collar on. And so I went up to them and I was like, I bet we're here for the same reason. And they're like, what? And I'm like, well, there's a convention this weekend. And they're like, oh, no, I'm not a furry. I'm a pup. I'm just kinky. And I'm like, okay, well, so like there's even those things that you might assume a person like fits that profile until they claim the identity themselves. We can't bestow it or bequeath it upon anybody, The community exists because people choose to identify and participate in that way. It's not given out arbitrarily, I guess.
Right. So like a pup could be a furry or a pup could not be a furry. It just depends on whether or not they identify with that.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And sort of now that we have a basic understanding of what it means to be a furry, I want to get more into the culture within furry communities. So just to understand what that looks like, are there certain demographics that are more represented than others within those communities?
Yeah, within the furry fandom, because anyone of any creed can, like 1973's Robin Hood by Disney and think that, wow, wouldn't it be swell to, be a walking, talking, dapper fox fellow? There is a big, diverse group of furries, but there does happen to be one group that primarily makes up the majority of at least the survey responding population in reference to the earlier firstscience.ca that I mentioned. And the largest group, the largest single group in the fandom is cisgender gay white men, just to be completely upfront about it. But there are other demographics that represent a large part of the community as well. Like we have a much higher than average autism ratio in the community because it's those sorts of, people that might have not had the biggest friend groups in school that sometimes end up on the internet and discovering these communities where they feel more welcome, Furry can be a collection of misfits at times, and that's why it's so predominantly queer. But we do have straight furries, we can't neglect, like I mentioned Disney's Robin Hood, but then I also should mention, to be fair, Fritz the Cat, which was like an NSFW R-rated animated film starring talking animals that made like $250 million in the 70s. Like it was the second highest grossing film of the year behind The Godfather. So it's like there are markets for these people and they do exist, but as for who makes up the largest percentage of convention going or community leader types, it does tend to be, the cis gay white men, and they tend to be a little bit richer too. There's a lot of money in the community. Suspiciously wealthy furries is a bit of a meme because, the artwork and the costumes and the conventions, everything is expensive, especially in today's economy,
Right.
So,
And
uh,
is that because it creates a barrier to access or a perceived barrier to access, do you think?
perceived barrier to access. Absolutely. I think that when people that are younger or just looking at how to get involved in the community, sometimes, they see these characters, or even like take me, for example, Cassidy Civet, the pop star. And if they see all the art that I have accumulated over the years or the costume, it seems like that's where you start to people that haven't started. But that's really not the case. Like I started and everyone else kind of starts the same way, which is just having the idea that maybe this is for me. And then when you explore it, maybe you're going through several different animals and iterations of a character design. And maybe you're meeting different people that are teaching you different things about the community that lead you to change even more. That's the growth and the development that comes once you're like in the community and you can create the version of yourself that feels the most true, but you are still you, right? And so it's just the character that you play in the community.
And coming back to that conversation around demographics, does that change depending on the location that you're in? Like, do you notice that those demographics are shifting as you're traveling around and going to different conventions?
Yes, that is just a wholehearted yes. I've been to over 50 conventions in my time. My home con is here in Vancouver called Vancouver, which is the closest one to us.
I imagine
Here.
they're not quite all they're not all quite that punny.
No, some of them have names that are just like names. Like the furthest one from here that I've been to would be in Florida, which theirs is called Megaplex, which is not a furry pun, but appears to be a name of movie theaters that existed in America. I don't know if they are still around. I don't know. I'm not American, but I went to Megaplex. And like I wouldn't go to Megaplex now because Florida has, some unique laws in place that would potentially have me as a, AMAB person dressing as a female character, where there's I don't know, figure out what is going on in Florida for that. And I wish them all the luck in the world, but I can't go out there again. But in America and different places in the States, the demographics change completely. Here, in our home con, Vancouver, the number of African Canadian furries that exist, I can count on one hand. It's like less than 5. But in the States, the number surges incredibly. But of course, then the number of Asian-born people drops. So it's different all over the place. I was at a convention in North Carolina, and the number of straight furries was very high. Like there were people like being like, yeah, I'm a volunteer firefighter and I have a wife and kids, and they've got like furry art on them. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. So it tells me how big the community is. You see the different animals change in regions too, because of the like high, Asian Canadian population we have here on the West Coast in Vancouver. There's a lot of, say, like red panda personas. But in the East Coast of the States, in like North Carolina, I saw a lot of dinosaur sonas, and I assume that's sort of because of the fossil exploration that might happen in that area. And there's a lot of big schools in North Carolina specifically, big universities and whatnot. I saw like woodland critter differences. Like there's more rabbits in the east of the US, and over here there's more like beavers. Like of course that would make sense because the Canadian and American difference, but
That would probably
it
be
really
my
changes.
persona if I became a furry.
A beaver?
Oh yeah, beavers are by far my favorite animals.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're gonna have to explore that maybe. But
Actually, it not so much in the human form, but as a kid, I used to pretend to be a beaver.
oh, oh,
Mhm.
that's cute. That sounds how very Therian of you.
There you go. Which brings me to another question, which is what is the difference between furries, other kin, and therians?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a big question. I will say for answering this question that I only identify as a furry of those ones. So, for definitions that might meet those communities' approval, you probably want to talk to them. But
Fair enough. Yeah.
um, from my understanding, Therian are people who believe that they were born in the wrong body, so or that believe that they have the soul of a given animal, you know? Kind of like that the video of I always think of that video from the 2000s as like in all ways I am a wolf. So it's sort of like that, I think. And so that's Therian. Otherkin, I think, is sort of a synonym for Therian. There might be another difference uh in that, but I'm less certain of that. But I know that it's more of the like they don't feel human
Mm-hmm.
is the main thing. They feel like they have the spirit of of an animal inside them and they feel trapped is my understanding. It's almost allegorical to the trans experience is how I've had people explain it to me. And I do fall on that spectrum as well, but in terms of like furry, I don't think I'm a civet, but I would love to be an anthro walking talking pop star civet. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
I like the animal, but I'm not the animal.
Right.
It's the
And
aesthetic
it's
that's the
difficult to
difference.
kind of create those comparisons as well because I mean, trans people are sort of under attack. Well, you're not really this person
Yeah.
that you say that you are, and so when you start getting into, well, I might be an animal, then it gives people more fuel, I guess, to say, okay, well, this sounds ridiculous to me, um, and and then there's also the fact that you have different cultural perceptions of how things work. Like, I don't know if indigenous people who feel a spirit of an animal within them are necessarily saying that they are Therian, for instance. And I don't know if someone who believes in reincarnation and that in a past life they were an animal and they carry that with them in this life, that they would call themselves that either. And because everyone has different ways that they um, I guess, self-identify, right? But it's interesting that these words now exist to describe these feelings that people are having about themselves. And
Yeah.
I want to get back to talking about these conventions a little bit too. So when you're
Oh yeah.
going and traveling to these conventions, what exactly is happening there? Are people selling artwork? Is it like a networking opportunity? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, going to a furry convention, uh, the size of which can range drastically from a few dozen people to a few thousand people. So picking the event for you is a big thing. But as for what goes on there are sections for artists. There are artist alleys, there's dealers' dens. There tend to be panels with community members just running things of interest. I tend to run quite a few panels myself at conventions.
Mhm.
Some more interest based. I've done like POC furry meetups. I've done game shows, just a lot of that. I've done concerts at conventions too. There's musical events sometimes as well, though not as many as I'd like. Having been to as many conventions as I have, I'm like the traveling musician sometimes. So I'm like, I'd like to get in my costume and sing for you guys, and they're like, well, we don't have a mic, and I'm like, oh well. It was worth a try, but there tends to be a charity component to conventions as well. The vast majority of furry conventions are registered nonprofits, so no one is getting paid on staff. They don't bring in like celebrity guests like you did see it at like a Comic Con that are doing like $200 autographs. There's none of that usually at the convention. There might be a guest of honor or two, but they're usually within the furry community because there are so many like artists and animators and creative types. There's a big pool of people to choose from. I myself have been officially a guest of honor once and courted as a guest of honor two other times. And the conventions can raise thousands and thousands of dollars for charity. In 2024, which just ended, shout out the new year, furries collectively raised just under $2 million across every convention that we have on record that happened
Wow,
last year. So
that's
a
incredible.
lot of money going to a lot of charities. They tend to be primarily, if I were to like break them down, maybe like 60% animal welfare charities, 30% LGBT charities, and 10% to miscellaneous sorts of other charities, whether it's like veterans charities or something like that. So it all gets spread around depending on where the convention is, who's running it. The people have their different, groups that they would like to donate to, and the conventions change their charities every year too. So
Hmm.
yeah, a lot of people benefit from being able to act like a silly little animal, silly little guy.
That's amazing. And you mentioned that you're also a musician. So when you are doing your music, with whether you're performing or putting things out on the internet, whatever it might be, are you doing that as Nash, or are you doing that as your persona Cassidy?
Well, when I first started, the very first thing I released, I put out under, Nash, but I saw online that there just were a lot of people already with my name, and we all want to think that we're unique little snowflakes with our names, but no, not really. You're you're unique when you create the identity for yourself. And so then I decided to go all in on the Cassidy Civet name for my art, pretty much. So at this point, I've released 2 albums under the name of Cassidy Civet. It's all online, streaming and everything. Several singles. I've flown myself to Europe to try and compete for Eurovision under the name Cassidy
Wow.
Civet. So, uh, yeah, I've been all over the place. I was on Canada's Got Talent for all of 10 seconds in my costume as Cassidy Civet, proudly repping my home city on my name right before all the buzzers came down. And while some in the furry community have tried to belittle that experience, because it's like, oh, you got buzzed out on Got Talent, you must be like a talentless hack or whatever. I know that those 10 seconds were seen by a lot of people, and I probably created furries even with my little bit of public humiliation, and I'm okay with that. I've been approached by people as far as like Georgia in the States at a convention one time. It was like 3 a.m. I was going back to my room, and this girl just comes up to me and she's like, "Weren't you the furry from American Idol?" And I'm like, wrong show, wrong country, wrong network, but general ballpark. So,
Hmm.
I'm like, yeah, I'll take it. And if, people get exposed from CSI or from my on screen appearance, I'm good with that. And I'm just here and happy to like create and share my creations with people that are willing to appreciate the art.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's sad that anyone would try to belittle you for that, because I mean that's an accomplishment, just getting there and having that exposure, like you said. So I mean, congratulations on that. That's really cool. Similar to the question that I asked previously about the difference between furries and other kin and Therian,
Hmm.
what overlap, if any, is there between furries and bronies? Like, are you getting bronies at furry conventions and vice versa? Is there any crossover there?
I like that phrasing. Do you get furries at brony conventions or vice versa? So there is definitely, it's a hot topic within the brony space. I spent like a year ish as like a kind of a periphery brony in like 2012. I was like a little bit interested in the show. I
Oh,
had
I
a
guess
couple
we should
shirts.
explain that. It's based off of My
Yes.
Little Pony, right?
My
So
Little
these.
Pony, Friendship is Magic specifically is the show that started the whole brony movement, because in the early 2010s, a bunch of 4chan people were like, "Hey, this show for little babies is actually kind of like good and funny." And then it literally, I believe, was a 4chan post where the word brony got said for the first time.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's like, and you can think whatever you'd like of people that use 4chan, but the community that erupted from that term just being coined was crazy. The bronies are different from furry because they do circle a singular property, being that of the Hasbro owned My Little Pony
Mhm.
TV show. So their conventions, I've been to one brony convention. Theirs are theirs are different from furry conventions in a few key ways, but behind the scenes, they're all still just run by furries that like the pony show too.
Gotcha.
So some bronies are very cagey about the fact that they are deep down probably furries, but they tend to find that safety in the parameters of a show and a universe that already exists, and maybe they're not taking that step towards furry, which in a way can be a bit more of a nebulous concept, right? Because it's like you're not being slotted into an existing universe or world, which is why I think a lot of people like everything from Star Wars to My Little Pony. You know, there's that familiarity of a concept. But bronies, like a big thing that they do better, I think, and bronies should get credit, is that they do have like wall-to-wall musicians, because the show My Little Pony has basically a song every episode. So it would make sense that their conventions then have a big emphasis on music, and they pay their performers and they fly them in from all over. So instead of, getting, and they actually do also at the brony cons, they do more of the like Hollywood celebrity angle, because they are again based on a show, so they can get those voice actors, right? They can get directors from the studio here in Vancouver, which is where they made the show. Shout out DHX Media, though I think that they renamed to Wildbrain. Yeah, so furries, by contrast, like we don't tend to bring in voice actors unless the voice actor already shows interest in furry. Like for people that know the show Beastars, the main voice from that show has shown up at conventions, or Agrexico, that was also on Netflix. The voice for Haida has gone to conventions before. Someone made him a suit and he wore it at a convention he was a guest at. So that was cool. But that's usually what it takes for furries to pull in someone with that sort of like, professional background, is they need to show interest in the fandom first. But bronies, they can pull from anyone that has, connection to their show. I would like furries to take a few notes from the brony subculture. We could use more musical events, and being that furry is so nebulous, and as a musician myself, I've prided the fact that my music has been pretty much entirely original. I have like one song that's inspired by something, but in the fandom, there's not a lot of attention on music because it's not as visual. Furry is a very visual community. It's artwork, it's costumes, it's it's icons in a chat room, but often too neglected is the music and the writing. There are furry writers. There's a whole bunch of furry books out there. You could probably even think of books with animals that talk that were not written by furries but have inspired furry writers. Like Watership Down or Redwall, and all these books that came out before that shaped the community. We've created all our own artists and writers and musicians now. So the bronies figured it out because they were already like, praising an existing work. But the furries need more arts focus, I think. It would be beneficial for the creatives in the community.
Right. Oh, I didn't even think about the Redwall connection, and I'm staring at Redwall books on my
You have
bookshelf
Redwall
right now.
books?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I used to read them all
Wow.
the time.
I love the Nelvana show.
The which show, sorry?
The Canadian show that Nelvana made for Redwall in the like late 90s.
I don't actually
2D.
know if I've seen that.
Oh my gosh. It's like really good. It's got a lot of Canadian like royalty in the voice cast too, like from Corner Gas, from like Alison Pill is in it, from Scott Pilgrim. Like it's got a lot of good names in it.
Huh.
Oh,
Yeah,
free
I'll
on
have to
YouTube.
check that
Recommend.
out. Okay, good to know. And I think one of the things that sort of makes people uncomfortable with furries, or maybe even bronies, and I don't know so much about that that aspect of the culture, but it's this idea that there's a sexual fetish component. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is there inherently some sort of sexual fetish component, or is there are there people that have a sexual fetish that then join the furry community? Is that why that perception exists? I'm trying to understand why people have that perception and whether or not there's any truth to it, I guess.
Yeah. I will open this question response with a little bit of a joke slash, story that I'm telling from someone else.
Mhm.
But, conventions in America, people are dressed in costumes. And I knew someone that was in like a diner and they had their like furry costume on and they were just like getting food. And two dudes came in dressed in their like, their business attire. And they were very curious about furry as well. And they go up to them and they're like, "Do you have sex in that thing?" And and the person's like, "It's a $2,000 like carpet. It would be really hot. Do you have sex in your suits?" And that kind of shut the businessmen up a little bit. But also you kind of would have to, think to yourself, they probably do. So it's sort of like, we don't want to cast stones on anyone who engages in, private activities as adults do. But that curiosity is natural, right? So as to whether the furry community as a whole is like a fetish, I would say to a degree that it is an interest, but as to how motivated by sexuality it depends on the person. I think that fetish on its own, if it meant purely like a sort of a special interest, and I think the term kind of can mean that because at least to me, I kind of do a distinction between fetish and kink. And is furry a kink for everyone? No. Is furry a fetish for everyone? It's a little bit closer to like, yes, if it is to be just like that interest that you're like hyper like tuned into. Maybe I'm getting my definitions wrong there, but the majority of furries are, adults who are of age, so they can do whatever they want in their hotel rooms, and they're not doing it in big piles in the lobby, which is, I think, one of those like internet rumor things that tends to get circled around where it's like, oh, the convention, there was a big cuddle pile in the lobby. And like, no, that doesn't happen.
I'm also
So-
sensing that there's sort of these inappropriate questions that will sometimes get asked. Like, as a trans person, it's what's in your pants, right? Like that's a question that we get all the time. But in the furry community, like I can't imagine going up to someone saying, "Do you have sex in that?" Like that's
Yeah.
none of my business. What are you doing asking a question like that? Is that something that you deal with a lot?
Yeah, I've worn my costume in quite a few public places. I wore it on set for a movie I was an extra in once. I wore it while we were doing all the shooting for Canada's Got Talent. And I did get approached by people asking that question like quite a few times. And it really is an expensive carpet with foam insulation. Like it's not that comfortable. Obviously, people will find their way around that maybe, and they'll do it anyway. But I am an asexual person too, so that's just not something that comes into my experience in the community, nor is it something that I had my costume designed to do. And it's not something I would want to potentially ruin my costume with, such an act. But it's a question that's asked and faced almost exclusively by people that dress up in the community that get asked this question, because no one is like going up to people at conventions that aren't in suit and asking, "Do you have sex?" Because that's silly, right? And people are only interested in this misuse of a prop. But to a lot of furries, their suits are works of art. They're handmade by like craftspeople. They cost thousands of dollars. So like to me, the question is more like, do adult human beings have sex? And the answer to that, I think, is yes.
Right.
Do you then have sex in proximity or with your expensive piece of custom, clothing? And that answer changes from person to person. So,
Right. I guess it would be
that's-
like, do you have sex in your Gucci outfit? Well, if
Exactly.
you're rich enough, maybe. I don't know.
yeah, keep the Gucci socks on when you're
Yeah.
Yeah, so that to me is what it is when people ask, do you have sex in that suit? You can ask the businessman the same question and they will be as uncomfortable, but they will, if you explain it like this, you tell them the value in this because furries have their connection to their character, to their costume. It's individual as to whether or not the person would do it. Do we have sexual deviants in the community? Sure. Does every community? Like I've been to hotels with furry conventions where like the lobby staff are like, no, the furries are great. It's the dentists that come here and they trash the place. Everyone's got their stories and there's so much more going on in this world than even we know. But furries are the ones that have that outward facing, like, what is that going on? But at the end of the day, it's adults doing adult things. And does it really bother you if you don't see it? It doesn't
Right.
bother me.
Yeah, and I think the visibility is that piece, right? People, if they don't understand it and it's visible, they're going to probably create some kind of story in their mind about what that actually means,
filling in
even
the
if it's not
gaps.
true. Exactly. And I don't know if I timed this question quite right in the order of things because now I want to talk about the youth. And A friend of mine works at a local high school, and she was telling me when I mentioned that I was doing this interview that she works with kids every day, and it appears that furries are a huge topic of conversation, like really popular within high schools these days. Are you noticing that? Does it appear that furry culture is becoming more prevalent among youth, or has it always been sort of a um, I guess a younger demographic that engages in furry culture? What are you noticing in terms of trends there?
That's a good question. In terms of trends, I will say that I don't think that the fandom has ever skewed quite this young before, and I don't think that that's necessarily like as a result of new furry things for kids. It's not as though we're seeing a surge in 6-year-olds because Paw Patrol is the big thing right now, or Bluey. But I think it's that matter of accessibility in that, every kid's got a phone, every kid's got an iPad and whatever these days, like scrolling TikTok, and they're discovering that these groups exist. And yes, the ratio of, under 18 kids that are showing up at conventions these days is really, really high. There's a convention happening literally right this second in Seattle, just south of us, that doesn't even call itself a furry convention. It calls itself like an anthropomorphic event because they don't want the label of furry. And this event is also like the only one in North America that is entirely like a safer work event. There is no aspect of an adult side to this convention.
Mhm.
So those things are starting to pop up more now and catering to that audience. But I think the reason that there's so many young people in it is because, coming out of that high school or, grade school experience, especially if you're one of those outcasts types, like I mentioned earlier, tend to make up a lot of the community, is that when you are getting older and either you go into university or just go into working, that in that span before you're like 25 or 30, so like in between 18 to 25, maybe 18 to 30, you might have more either free time or a little bit more money than you might have later in life, and you're not quite settled all the way in yet. So you might travel, you might buy furry artwork, you might get a costume. And then as you get older and you start to like realize, yeah, this is not that sustainable of a lifestyle, I might have to lock in and, do the adulting thing. We see less engagement from people. And this is also reflected actually in the stats from Fur Science, which, like I said, they can't get data from under 18, but we have the data from 18 plus. So we can see that as people get older, their participation in the community, at least in an in-person level, does tend to drop because as you're in the community, you make those friends, and those friends might be all you need, right? And then you don't need to go to the 5,000 person convention anymore and wait 5 hours in a reg line to get a name tag that has your furry name on it. Maybe you're just content. So, and that can happen. And there's nothing wrong with, becoming a content adult, but kids want that kind of acceptance too, but they are not adults, right? So an important thing in the furry community is that spaces that are, not safe for work or 18 plus, they have those, verifications to make sure that minors are not finding their way in those spaces, right? And we care
Mhm.
very much about that as well. So like even at conventions, if there's like a big dealer's den where there's like, hundreds of artists where you can buy prints of your favorite furry characters from all sorts of media or get a custom artwork, there might be a little tented off area where they're doing ID checks at the door. And inside there's a little bit more of the spicier content for sale. But kids are, depending on the convention, sometimes young people are made to feel welcome and sometimes they're unwelcome. It really depends. And I think that the reason that there are so many now is because of the internet. The internet's connecting and exposing people to all sorts of ideas, and creativity is being unlocked. And I love to see that because that's what I joined Furry for. I
Mhm.
joined the community because I wanted to express myself in a way that wasn't so reliant on how I looked in real life. As a
Mhm.
musician, I wanted people to listen to my music and not judge it based on like how attractive I am. Like that is not something that I was interested in, doing. So people, that's what it is. And young people want the escapism too, and they just need to be told quite clearly, you know, like you're not an adult yet, and the spaces will become available to you later. So take your time. You don't need to rush into it. You don't have the disposable income of a, 25-year-old, like post-university, like first job sort of person. It's okay if you go slow and you just spend the time like consuming furry content on the internet. It's fine. And personally, I did, and I will like kind of level out on the experience of being a minor in the furry community, because I did start in the community as a 17-year-old. My first convention that I ever went to was in 2016. So next year would be my 10 years as an officially con-going active member of the community. So I was 17. I was in a panel at my first convention that was a 2-hour panel from like 8 to 10 p.m. And at 9 p.m. it switched to the 18 plus. So I remember being in the room and the host is like, so now it's 9 o'clock, and if anyone is not 18, please leave. And I was the only one that left. So I remember those experiences. And one thing I would say to young people is that try to inform your parents too, because they probably don't know the ins and outs of the community as much as you, if you've been consuming this content online, right? And you're like, I'm interested in this. You should tell your parents. You should inform them as to like what the community actually is, because there's, they might have watched that CSI episode 20 years ago. I know my parents did. So those perceptions can be changed and made to look outdated and, as misrepresenting as they are. But the only way to convey what the community actually is as a young person to an adult is to tell them. And usually young people also need an adult chaperone at conventions up to a certain age as well, too. So keeping everyone on the same page, too, is very important. When I was a minor in the community, I definitely regret that I didn't like inform my parents as to the extent of the community. Because, you're still a young person, you're new to the world, and you don't want to be, you don't want to find yourself in a place where you're not welcome. So you have to know where the spaces are for you. And then when you're 18, the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want, wild abandon and stuff. But yeah,
Right.
you got to take it slowly.
Yeah, I mean, and as an adult now, as an adult furry, do you find that it's awkward to interact with youth? I know as a trans person, because there's this false perception that we're like sexual deviants of some kind. There's a demographic of the population that would say, I should never be around a child. And while that's ridiculous, it impacts when I will interact with kids. Like, I don't want to bring that on, so I will specifically avoid situations where kids might be around for that purpose. Do you struggle with that at all as a furry?
With interacting with
With
kids and the
interacting
youth?
with kids and the perception that people have of that?
I think that a lot of furries are uncomfortable when having to interact with youth, and a lot of them, especially once they become adults, are very much happy to put that, fence up and say, sorry, do not enter if under 18. Uh, myself having started as a minor in the community and also being asexual myself, I'd also just like to talk. So I'm more than happy to explain it with parents. I was the youth like coordinator at Vancouver for a few years as well when I was in my earlier 20s. And it is just about that exception. You want people to feel accepted. And so, we can put those things up, and we absolutely need to have the guardrails in place so that the minors know which parts of the community they have access to. But me personally, I'm not made uncomfortable by the presence of minors within the furry fandom, because it is, they're all plush, walking, talking animals. Who wouldn't be interested in something like that? There's a reason Bluey's the biggest show on TV right now. There's no shame in it. Kids are very creative. Kids will come up with all sorts of stuff. Kids love to make things. They'll make their own costumes, and so it's just a way to channel that, childlike wonder and creativity. And it's that I would, like me, being ace, I'd love to see more creativity in the fandom. And, I don't want to like rag on the 18 plus side of the community too much. Being that I'm ace and I have no participation or awareness really of just how deep it goes but I've seen the walls that they put up if it's like you don't participate in that space. So if you are not a member of that group, it can be an isolating experience to be a furry. But if you stick it out, you will find your people eventually. And that's something that I would say. And just like I said that cis gay white men make up the majority of the community, like 85%. Ace is about 10%, and like, okay, well, this doesn't equal 100, so maybe my numbers are off, but like straight furries do exist, and ace furries also exist, and we make up about the same percentage. So in that way, I don't quite relate to the majority of the community, like at all, on any level, because they don't reflect me. And even as a young person coming into the furry fandom, seeing the creators online, I was able to parse like who was like me, even behind like the costumes. It's like there's so much that goes into it in America, in that side of the scene as well. There's more the money involved. Like if you have a lot of money to join the community, things will come to you easier. I knew a furry miner in Alberta whose parent worked the oil fields, so they had a lot of money, and so she was like 13 and she got a full costume, and she went and did like the dance competition and stuff. So it's like great. It's cool that you're able to do that. But the creativity shouldn't be like hampered either by inaccessibility to those adult spaces. They're not necessary to have a good experience in the community either. And I can speak to that as an adult as well. You don't need to be in those spaces. And it's the accessibility to the materials or the money to make those things happen. Kids will make crafts of anything. I've seen like just the paper mask, like with an animal on it and the eye holes cut out. It's a big range in expression, and that's the beauty of it. And it should all be made to be okay. And the walls are necessary at times, but they just can't be, they can't. Isolating people is really a bummer. And especially in the internet era here too, that we are in now, that can be more common than we'd like to admit. But stick it out and you'll find your people.
Yeah, and you've kind of talked about already some of the things that you want to see change. Is there anything else that you want to see shift as this furry culture progresses? This is kind of a question that I try to wrap all of these episodes up with, and we have a couple more still to come. But what is your hope for the future of furries?
I believe that for the future of furry, it's going to continue relatively as is. So the future that I'd like to see change is the one that goes on at the conventions themselves. I'd like us to borrow some notes from the bronies. I would like to see musicians be given more of a platform and paid even. I'd like to see some of the leadership at conventions become as diverse as the community that it's, running. At least in my experience, unfortunately, the majority of cons tend to be run by those, the 80% of dominant cis gay white men in the community. So when I show up and I'm out there being my, femme civet self with my, tan skin and my long dark hair, I've felt that sort of like isolation or vague unwelcomeness from sects of that community, where they look at me and they learn who I am, and they realize that I'm not interested in engaging with them on that primal level, I guess is a way to put it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of the connections that people make in the community. It really comes down to like, who do you get along with? And then, who do you get along with? You know what I'm saying? Because I think that, I don't want to speak to it too much again because I'm ace, but I am queer. I put that label on myself. The casualness that can sometimes happen within queer spaces, whether it's like the poly relationships or whatever it is, there sometimes is that, because when we move past the societal taboos, right, then we're left with these topics that are more spicy, and then we find the people that connect with us on those topics, and sometimes those can go places, right? But knowing my limits, knowing what you're comfortable with as your own individual is a big part of what will define your experience in the furry fandom. So what I would like to see changed is the fandom, at least in the way of conventions, become a little bit more tolerant of everyone that doesn't just fit that kind of mold. I talked about like the 18 plus section of the dealer's den hall. Conventions will like prioritize who is selling in their like den space months before they even have a panel schedule list. So like I said there's a convention happening right now. In 2 weekends, there will be further confusion in San Jose, California. That convention's already got its dealers list published. You can see all the people who will be selling, but the schedule's not out yet. I'm running like 4 different panels. I know when I'm doing my stuff, but I haven't seen the full schedule yet. So I'd like cons to prioritize the creativity and the people who are willing to put themselves out there to run the things that draw attendees in, because not every attendee has $100 to drop on custom artwork in the dealer's den. I know I don't really go in the dealer's den when I'm at conventions, not because I have an aversion to, the artwork or anything like that, but because I'm just not really that interested in buying a print of a Pokemon character or whatever. I'd rather get either art of myself or maybe the one shirt the convention makes for its year. I have so many convention shirts, but there needs to be a well-rounded experience for every member of the community at our conventions in order for everyone to get the best experience. There should be a quiet room for people to, not be in the big crowd so they can just draw or read or whatever it is. Those spaces are great. Just places where people can be themselves and they aren't pressured to engage in the economy of the furry fandom would be a big thing. And whether the economy is paying money for artwork or gaining favor for, participation, as it were, I would like to see the community become a little bit more equal on that front. I'd like creatives to be respected for what they contribute and not just who they know.
With all of that in mind, what do you think our audience can do to help create that future, achieve that future?
Well, I imagine that your audience is not primarily furry.
I would say that's probably accurate.
Furry listeners that you may have.
We probably have some, yeah.
To that, I would say push back. When people are saying things that are dishonest and that misrepresent the community, if like you're listening to the words that I say, and I say that the majority of the community is full of like friendly walking, talking animals in costumes that are raising money for charity and going to conventions to have a good time, see friends, party, dance, buy merch. We're not talking about the lootier side. And when people focus exclusively on that, that's when I'm like, okay, it would be nice to have more allies. So what I'm saying is, what can people do? Maybe check out a convention sometime if you'd like, but what we need are more allies. We need people that know what these words mean: fursona, furry, even therian. Knowing the difference is important, because then when people say, well, all furries, they just want to be animals, you can push back against that and say, no, that's not actually true. Furries are humans that might dress up as a character they create. That, to me, is what will start to sort of bring up the general pop culture awareness of what furry is. I think there's still a big blank spot for that in some way. Even bronies are better understood to a degree by the public because they have that association with an existing property. And it's because furry is so nebulous in that conception where it becomes a little bit hard and it means different things to everybody, right? So it's having allies. That would be my biggest, the thing that I would like for people to do. Get educated, right? That's what you have to do it when it's a blind spot you might have. You don't know. Don't let your imagination fill in the gaps like some sort of Fox News commentator, but do the research. There are literally government-funded studies that you can look at right now that will tell you all sorts of things. And, the resources are out there. Have a look. Talk to people like me that aren't shy about it and that will gladly explain and break down everything that I've been through, everything I've experienced, and what the community means to me. Don't let someone who has no stake in this community explain it to you,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap things up?
I'm taking a bit of a music break this year. Been like those 2 albums came out over those past few years of post-COVID vibe era stuff. So the sad era is over and we're going on to a brighter future now. And coming up locally, there's going to be some exciting developments around us here in the lower mainland part of BC. There's going to be a little bit of a by-election to replace a school board trustee that just got promoted into our provincial government.
Mm-hmm.
So, there might be a civet that has been eyeing that seat with some consideration.
That's some
Rubbing,
hot news.
yes, rubbing her paws together over here. I feel like I could bring a whole lot to the board, especially as a young person, as a Gen Z, as hesitantly as I would be to call myself that, being born in '98. But hey, it's what the internet says I am, so I got to embrace it. Whether it's like the rise of AI in schools and all of that too, that just like with furry, people just don't understand it until it's explained to them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I'm hoping to bring awareness to with a potential run for trustee. So we'll see how that goes. There'll probably be more information on that by the time this comes out, but we'll have to take our time. It will be my first attempt doing anything like that. So, we'll see if there's a spot in the future for a creative and artistic driven, young furry person.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wish you all the best if that's the route that you decide to go. And if people are interested in following along and maybe keeping their eye out for an announcement in the future, where would they go and find you to look into that?
Yes. Right now, most of my social media is the furry name, which is Cassidy Civet. But once the campaigning really gets going, I should have some more socials open just for that are a little bit more human, with a little bit more human appeal, as it were. So I will share those on my furry social medias likely when they get made, though they are not made yet. We are still kind of conceiving all of this, but the timeline will move quick. So, if you want to stay in the loop, just look up Cassidy Civet. Everything will come up online if you look it up. Whether you use Google or another search engine that is not using AI in their results, we got all the info out there, and I'm very accessible, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes for me.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, congratulations and good luck on your run for school board, if that's the announcement that's coming, and it sounds like it probably is. And thank you so much for coming to talk about furries today. I think it's a topic a lot of people don't understand, and hopefully we have some listeners that have come away from this with a whole new understanding of what it means to be a furry. Maybe you've addressed some of their misconceptions, and follow Cassie on social media, stay up to date, learn more, and try to be a good ally, because it sounds like that's what's really needed at the moment. So thank you again. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling. Today, I've been joined by Nash Milani, otherwise known as Cassidy Civet.
Cassidy Civet. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you so much for having me on, and we'll see about talking about bringing that beaver self out sometime.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.